Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to tonight's presentation, R.L. Forrest, Dairy Farmer, Citizen Scientist, Philanthropist. So my name is Allison, and I work for the St. Mary's County Library System. And our guest speaker tonight is Dr. Jim Gibb. So he's going to be the one leading the presentation. He's going to be sharing some slides on his screen. And he has asked the people who were involved in the research project about R.L. Forrest to be unmuted during this meeting so that you can correct him if you need to. Jim, you can feel free to add to that.
Okay, well, I'm going to share now. Okay, I will warn everybody that I don't have my off-board mouse with me, so I'm going to be a little clumsy with the slides. So this is a different talk than what I usually do. This is a project that is in progress. Several of the people who are on the team are on the call, and I've asked them to remain unmuted so that any errors I make, they can correct in real time. There's a lot of information we've gathered. This is our first attempt at sort of kind of bringing it together into some sort of meaningful narrative. So if it seems like things don't quite fit together, that's why we're still working on this. Okay. Now let's see how I'm going to advance the slides. Looks like I'm going to be using my finger. So this is part of the last will and testament of a guy named Robert Lee Forrest, born 1876, died 1962, I think. And it's a very simple will. It has 5 parts. First, he wants to be buried at sea without any religious ceremony, which tells you a little bit something about the guy and why we should be interested in this guy in the first place. I'll get to in a moment. But religious, he probably was not. He gave some of his effects at his death to his nieces, nephews, and any surviving siblings, his brothers. And, watch, basically jewelry, not really very much. The fifth article basically appoints his executors, but it's the fourth one I bring your attention to because he's giving all of his wealth to the Smithsonian Institution. And that's why he's of interest to us. The question is why? What he gave basically created the foundation for an entire unit of the Smithsonian Institution, and that's the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center. Think of it in terms of the National Museum of American History or the National Museum of Natural History. Those are units of the Smithsonian. Well, we have the Smithsonian Environmental Research Center built initially on land that Robert Lee Forrest gave us. He also gave the Smithsonian Institution $1.7 million. This came as news to the Smithsonian. The lawyers showed up at the castle and said, okay, here it is. What do you want to do with it? They had no inkling. So our question is, why? Why did this guy, and he's a fairly unusual fellow, why did he make this very substantial donation to the Smithsonian Institution? Again, this is a team effort. I think I've got everybody on here, but I may have missed a couple of folks. It's hard for me to keep track because this is one of many projects we run at any one time at CERC. Joanne DeVincent's our project manager. We have all these folks who bring various interest and skills and experiences to the project. And I won't go into detail because several folks actually wear several different hats.
Yeah, Jim, we need Brian on there too.
I forgot Brian. Thank you. So let me talk a little bit about Robert Lee Forrest, his early years. Again, the question here is, why did this guy give all this wealth to the Smithsonian? And one of the parallels we're drawing right now is that James Smithson, who gave the initial bequest, 100,000 pounds, to the people of the United States to create a Smithsonian institution. He was a Brit and had a lot of his aspects of his life were parallel to those of Robert Lee Forrest. So early background, I won't say he came from a humble situation. His father, Andrew Jackson Forrest, was a civil engineer working for the city of Baltimore. He basically was in water delivery, if you will, pumping station for the city, and was assigned that task in 1900. I don't know offhand the exact years in which he worked for the city of Baltimore, but he was essentially a mid-level city employee. So a little bit about his background. First of all, he was named Robert Lee Forrest, which should tell us a little something right off about his family. I mean, clearly, certainly in 1876, barely 10 years after the end of the Civil War, the choice of that name probably wasn't an accident. And I don't think in Linda's genealogical research into this fellow, whether it was anybody else in the family by that name, but it suggests that the family had Southern sympathies, which would not have been unusual in Baltimore in that period. He was also born in 1876, which makes him a centennial baby. The centennial was a major celebration throughout the country, celebrating 100 years of independence. Uh, there's a World's Fair in Philadelphia, an exhibition that was built up around that commemorative date. Lots of celebrations. So that probably influenced him a little bit. He was the son of Andrew Jackson Forrest. Again, that name Andrew Jackson is it doesn't show up. It's not a family name, but clearly Andrew Jackson's father had certain sympathies with the former president of the United States, a Southerner, and one some of whose actions have since been questioned, constitutionality and such. The family claimed ancestry from a Jamestown settler. Linda Perkins has researched this with the genealogical research and has found no direct connection with the Forrest family and this apocryphal original settler. As you'll see in a moment, he bought this basically an historic house. I'm not quite sure when, but in Philadelphia, let's say sometime around 1900. And he filled that house with fine arts and antiques. This is something that we haven't quite analyzed yet, but Leo Plourde has taken the auction catalog and converted it into a more conventional archaeological catalog that we can analyze the various possessions he collected. And then finally, he sold his house in Philadelphia, all of its contents, and his sailboat around 1911, 1912, and moved to Europe. Unfortunately for him, he arrived in Europe about the same time World War I began. So he made a hasty retreat, came back to the United States. So on the left and on the right, these are both photographs. One I think Tim got from just Google Streets, and the other one came from the auction catalog, which you'll see in a moment. But this is probably a late 18th or very early 19th century house. And again, he filled it with antiques. The census in 1910 recorded him as living there as head of household. The only other two people in his household were two Japanese servants. Again, the picture of the house on the left on 13th Street. And this is the title page for it's a printed, published auction catalog of the contents of his house. And you can see it says Chippendale, Hepplewhite, Sheraton, Adam Furniture, all sorts of things that he collected that even over 100 years ago would have been considered valued antiques. And so the contents of the house, all that material was recorded in this publication. So that's like an archaeological database. We have the contents of the house, not all the contents. They didn't record, his toothbrush and his coffee cup and, the other sorts of things we associate with daily living. These are things he collected. But still, it's a potential for an incredible insight into how this guy was living. He started out, I think around age 16, if I'm not mistaken, selling insurance, but he moved very quickly in the financial world. And this is a little clipping from a newspaper up in Shippensburg, Pennsylvania. Mr. Robert L. Forrest of Baltimore, representing W.J. Hayes and Sons, bankers of Cleveland, Ohio, was a business visitor to Shippensburg last week and was a pleasant caller at the newspaper office. He was 19 years old. And here he is visiting newspaper as, a business guy. So ambitious and chutzpah. 10 years later, we have this from the city directory of Erie, Pennsylvania. He's noted, this is like a phone directory like we used to have. And you can see Robert L. Forrest, president of C&E Traction Company, residing in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So he's listed in the directory, but he didn't actually live in Erie. And he was the president of that traction company, the Canoid and Erie Traction Company. What is a traction company? It's basically trolley cars, electric railroads. So he was the president of one of these things in 1900 at age 24. That company didn't fare very well, went into receivership, eventually was acquired by another railroad, which was acquired by another railroad, which was acquired. I mean, that was typical of the industry at the time. But 24 years old, he's the president of a company. Not bad. We have this advertisement from Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. Foreign gas company directors squeeze local consumers. Having no interest here save to secure dividends, they will not lower prices until forced to come within reasonable lines. Old companies were officered by Wilkes-Barrians. Trust exactions represent the greed for gold of those who live in other parts. So it's basically saying we've got a bunch of carpetbaggers running the city gas company. And chief among those carpetbaggers was Robert Lee Forrest of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And of the directors listed there, all but one who's from New York, all of them are from Philadelphia. These men had no interest in Wilkes-Barre or its people. Their only consideration was the gas and electric business that would bring Wilkes-Barre money to their pockets. The more money, the more interest on bonds and stocks and in Wilkes-Barre. So not the nicest thing you want somebody to say about you. And I mean, it's clearly a biased view. I mean, the opening sentence there, the Wilkes-Barre Gas and Electric Company commences monopoly in the lighting of this city. So monopoly, right off tells you that they're not very friendly to this group of directors. But this is how he made his money, this and similar ventures. He took some of that money in 1900 and bought a yacht from one of the Vanderbilts, William Vanderbilt II, I think, called the Carmita, and he held that at least until 1905. This is work that John McGrath has been doing, tracking down this and 3 other vessels that Forrest eventually acquired. But this was a racing yacht, but it was also something to hang out in too. We know he was racing. John's collected some information on this, but he's clearly with the jet set, if you will, if that's the appropriate term to use for a bunch of sailors in 1900. But he's certainly mixing with the very wealthy. I mean, he bought this off one of the Vanderbilts. He replaced that. He had a new Carmita number 2 built in 1907, held it till 1912. We don't have an image of this, just a model of it. We have some details on it. We may yet find an etching of it, or maybe even a photograph. But again, he's hanging out with the elite. He's he's looking like somebody who comes from fairly modest means and is getting wealthy very quickly, and he was using that wealth to insinuate himself among the upper classes. And remember, he's claiming ancestry from a Jamestown settler. He has a southern name with some panache, as does his father. And he has this historic house he's living in Philadelphia, filled with fine arts and antiques. So this is not what you'd expect from the son of a civil engineer who's just sort of making his way in the world. He was also involved in this movement to basically create the intercoastal waterway. That's very popular among sailors and other boaters today, running up and down the eastern seaboard and then over to the Gulf. So he was part of a convention promoting this. And in fact, the following year, the United States passed the Rivers and Harbors Act of 1909, which was very much about developing this intercoastal waterway. But this is not a business thing. This is a recreational thing, and again, hanging with some very prominent people. I mean, your average waterman out on the Chesapeake Bay would not be terribly interested in something like this because they're not taking their boats down to Florida. This is folks with some money and leisure time to be coasting up and down the eastern seaboard. We do have an image of his third boat, the Mana, which he had for sale in 1921. So he sold the Carmita II in 1912 and then decamped to Europe. Then came back to the U.S. and a few years later, and we don't know exactly when he purchased this vessel, but then he turned around and sold that in 1921, and he would then have a fourth boat, which I don't have any information in this presentation on. But this is, it's got a motor, so it can motor. It's not just a sailboat. And in this advertisement says accommodation sofa in new deck house over cockpit, 2 sofas in cabin, 2 bunks, forecastle, galley, and toilet. This isn't just a racing vessel. It's a cruising vessel. It's something meant perhaps more for enjoyment rather than competition. The big part of our research is focused on Forrest as a dairy farmer. And this is in the Chesapeake area. You say Chesapeake Bay, dairy farming doesn't jump right to mind. If you go out to Western Maryland, yeah, sure, Northern Maryland, but coastal plain and even much of the Piedmont of Maryland, you don't really associate that with dairy farming. But we know, first of all, he had made a trip to Europe, came back from Liverpool, arriving in New York in 1911 on the Lusitania. And most of you probably, that name should sound familiar because about 3.5 years later, a German U-boat sank that vessel. Didn't exactly create warm relations with the United States. There were a lot of Americans on board. He returned to Europe on the eve of World War I, and you got to wonder, why did he decamp? Why did he leave the United States? Why did he sell his possessions? He sold his house, the contents of it, his sailing boat, the Carmita, and then moved to Europe. Why? And we know why he came back. I mean, World War I broke out across Europe. Came back and he bought the Java farm, which I think was just sort of a conventional farm, tobacco and grains. He bought that in 1915. This is a guy who had a lot of money. Why did he do that? Why did he start a dairy farm? Anybody who knows anything about dairy knows if you're a dairy farmer, you have been enslaved by cows. Dairy farming is 365 days a year. Those cows need to be milked 2-3 times a day. They don't observe holidays. They don't observe weekends. So, I mean, it's not my idea of good living. So he took this farm, which probably wasn't in the greatest of shape. It had been operated by mostly tenant farmers over the years, but he redeveloped it as a dairy farm rather than as what would be a conventional farm locally. Again, why did he do that? We do have a drawing of the farm. Uh, this is in Smithsonian archives, and the state of Maryland has a copy. And you'll see at the lower left hand, it says Java Farm, which is the name of the farm, circa 1925 to 1945. So that's that farm, the layout of fields and everything, very likely changed. And it should be 1915 to 1945. So this is kind of a snapshot in time, sometime during that 30-year period. We don't know if it always looked like this. You'll notice it identifies the various fields. Most of them are given over to alfalfa, so they're used to produce food for the dairy cattle. There is one small field where they're growing barley. It says barley/wheat. My guess is the barley was also meant as fodder for the cows. There's a couple of these little areas that are for mules, providing a lot of the traction power, which suggests that this map shows the farm earlier in its history, because although he may have continued using mules for traction, for plows and reapers and stuff like that, we know he was very early on had adopted motorized tractors. And I don't see anything in here that says anything about tractor sheds. So this could be early. You'll see there are two squares there. The lower one representing identifying the spring house, which I'll talk about in a moment. And north of that is another square around another building. It doesn't tell us what that building was for, which is really annoying because we've been working on that building, documenting it, and we still don't know what the hell it was used for. The ellipse over to the far right shows where his house was. We have not done any work on the house yet. We know there's a foundation out there. I am looking forward to doing some excavation around it because he was a bachelor farmer. He was the only one who lived in that house. Any trash we find is stuff that was purchased and handled and used and eventually thrown out by Robert Lee Forrest. It's very rare in archaeology when you can actually take artifacts and associate them with a specific individual. Usually it's a household, and if the house has been occupied for a number of decades, then it's probably even a succession of households. So we have got a lot of advertisements. There is no published history of Robert Lee Forrest. And so the team has really been seeking out information in every possible nook and cranny of the archival record. So it's really quite a mishmash of material, but hopefully it's beginning to emerge into some sort of not just a narrative, but a meaningful insight into who this man was and what made him do what he had done. So the first part, says he bought this farm from a guy named William Snyder, 366 acres. And then he advertised, that's in November. The following September, and probably before then too, he was advertising for an experienced man on dairy husbandry farm. 350 acres south of Annapolis, modern tile buildings. He was using state-of-the-art technology to build his buildings, his silos, using basically sort of like concrete blocks, but made of clay. He had a young Holstein herd, and we'll see just how young in a moment. High, healthful, beautiful location, etc. Salary and shares in production. He wants particulars. What do you want in terms of salary? References, no booze. Now, we shouldn't take this to mean that he did not drink. I don't know if he did or didn't, but he didn't want his laborers drinking, especially since they would be living on the farm, at least initially. The second announcement, 2 white farm hands for farm near Annapolis, good board and wages. That term shows up again in one form or another. He was specifically looking for white men. again, says something about the man.
Hey,
Uh,
Jim.
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Cindy posted in the chat, there's a second building marked as Forrest's house near the chickens. I think this was in reference to the slide with the map on it.
Yes. Yeah, there is another house up there, Forest House. It's right up in the middle. And if you go to Sir campus now, there's this brick wall that encloses a pond and a garden. The brick wall has been there a very long time. It's clearly much older than the garden it surrounds. That is where that house was located. How much time he spent living in there, we don't know. How old that house was, we don't know. We haven't done any archaeology in that garden, partly because I think we'd get in a lot of trouble if we started digging it up. But I haven't asked yet, but it's probably something we should do, is see if we could find some evidence of the house and find some artifacts that might tell us whether or not that's a particularly old house, 19th century, or if it's something that he built in connection with the farm. Good question, Cindy. We'll need to look at that.
Hey, Jim, while you
Yeah,
have that picture up, did you notice that there is a listed, it looks like a power, says it's a power line?
yeah. There are a couple of power lines.
Because that one looks
One,
like it runs from one of those places we've been digging out to
yeah,
Fox Point.
yeah. One runs pretty much from the spring house to Forest House at Fox Point. That's that ellipse on the far right-hand side. There is another one up north of that area. It's divided up into smaller pastures and whatnot. So he was electrified. Now, uh, I think he was producing his own electrical power. I don't think this is something that was brought in on the road. I don't think this was a public utility. A lot of houses in the area in late 19th, early 20th century had chemical batteries providing some power for the house, but it seems to me likely that he had some sort of generator. So he needed to generate electricity for his water pumping station, but it's very likely he was producing power throughout the farm. How extensive, we don't know. This is where the archaeology comes in. I mean, a lot of what we've been doing has been archival research, but there are a lot of interesting questions that the archival research probably will not answer because we simply cannot find that information. It just doesn't exist in writing, or it exists in some obscure place that we may or may never find. So archaeology becomes the way we do it.
Jim, the farm was electrified under REA in 1935 by
Yeah,
BGE has the records of it.
yeah, well, that's part of the rural electrification program of the 1930s, part of the attempt to get us out of the Great Depression. But it looks like he had power a good 20 years before that, and that certainly
Yeah.
wouldn't be BGE. So again, it's something we need to continue researching. What was he in the business of doing? Well, he's producing fluid milk, which we know he was bottling because we have milk bottles that were made specifically for Java Dairy Farm. We know he was producing buttermilk because he's got advertisements saying he's producing buttermilk, and this is all tested because at the time he started this dairy, bovine tuberculosis was a major issue across the country, as was adulteration of milk. A lot of folks were adding water and other such things to milk to stretch it so they can make money. And that's when the federal government, as part of the progressive era, started legislating to create and enforce a system for ensuring the production and sale of clean milk. So these advertisements give you a sense of that. The upper one, this is something George Reisling and Siri Reisling have been researching, and that is breeding cattle, breeding dairy cattle. It looks like this is really a major part of his business. He's running a dairy farm, but he's probably making a lot of money, maybe as much as from the dairy, in breeding and selling dairy cattle. Well-bred dairy cattle. By well-bred, I don't mean they had good table manners or anything, but these were cows whose mothers were big milk producers. They produced a lot of milk per season, And so other dairy farmers are interested in buying them, so they have good producers. I won't go into the names of the cows. Anybody who's interested could talk to George about that. The naming conventions for dairy cattle, for bred dairy cattle that are scientifically bred is beyond me. But you can see on that upper advertisement, 38 pounds fat, world's record at time. So butterfat content's really important. These are some of the data that George and Siri have collected on dairy cattle, and you could see this distribution. You could see at the far left-hand side where the herd begins with about 10 cows, not 9 cows in 1917, and it increases in sort of a stepwise progression, which suggests a certain, he's not just blasting away buying a lot of cattle, he's building that herd gradually over about 10, 12 years. And then in the 1930s, the growth of the herd accelerates, considered as a pretty steep, steady incline there. And then starting in the late 1930s, it begins to decline precipitously until he basically shuts down the farm around 1945. So a 30-year run, and this is basically, you could see the growth of the herd, and then he starts selling off the animals. One of the things he did was he purchased 2 acres up on the south edge of the Washington, Baltimore, and Annapolis Railroad. And I suspect, we don't have any information on this yet, as far as I know. This is just west of Annapolis. I think what he was doing is planning on being able to load fluid milk on the railroad for distribution around the state. At the time, a lot of the milk market was, I won't say monopolized, but dominated by Western Dairy, a company out in Western Maryland. Archaeological sites around the area, when we find milk bottles, it's usually Western Dairy milk bottles. So I think he might have had some ideas when he started out of doing, just that, of exporting his milk to a wider market. It's not clear to me that he ever did. I mean, he sold milk, but I suspect most of it was local. But we don't know yet. We're still researching it. And here you can see an advertisement from 1929 where he's pitching the milk, and it's great for children. It's the best milk obtainable. Pure milk. I mean, that's pure milk from purebred Holstein Friesian cows. That's something you could substantiate. Best milk obtainable. You can do that too because we can measure butterfat in milk. And that was true back into 1880s. I think the Babcock butterfat tester was invented. And of course, it can be tested for pathogens as well. Whether or not, they had a published report on that, we don't know. And so here are these advertisements you could see constantly talking about herd tuberculin tested by the U.S. Bureau of Animal Industry, and which lasted a couple of decades. It exists now, but in a much different form. So there's a real interest in producing high quality, healthful products that they could sell. One of the interesting, I mean, just perhaps a little bit of an aside, but we've been building up this sort of trying to understand who this guy was, trying to understand his personality. And as of our last meeting, which I think was last Wednesday, we were talking about, well, he seemed to be very social with the sailboats and everything. And then sometime after he bought the dairy in 1915, he seemed to become more isolated. Well, this is a piece from the newspaper in Hanover, Pennsylvania, where Forrest was part of this organization. And he had proposed, and I guess they actually did this, the outing this year will be in the form of an excursion to the modernly equipped farm of Robert L. Forrest along the Chesapeake Bay to be held August 18th. Many of the farmers from Local 2 will take this trip as a delightful program has been arranged for the farmers, their wives, and families. I mean, this is Robert Lee Forrest, who's basically organizing and hosting a party. in 1937. So what we thought we knew a little bit about him, we need to rethink that. This is a view of the core of the dairy farm. In 1973, the farm was abandoned by, largely abandoned by Forrest in 1945. So this is nearly 30 years later. There'd been a lot of vandalism over the years, but some of the buildings survived. You can see the building on the far left. You can see roof trusses. That might be a new one that the Smithsonian was building. In fact, that might be the administration building that exists now. You could see there's a bunch of cars parked there. This is the Smithsonian had acquired the property in 1963, 1964, established a research station there that eventually became the Environmental Research Center that we use today, which is very modern. And now, instead of 350 acres of Robert Lee Forrest, consists of some 2,700 acres, most of it contiguous, wrapping around the road and West Rivers. Some views of it when Smithsonian first took over. One thing you'll notice in these photographs is there's a lot of pavement. There's a lot of concrete. That would have been critical for an operation like this because you don't want dairy cows tromping along in the mud, which is mixed with cow manure, because you want them to be very clean. And so you want to be able to hose them down. You want to be able to hose surfaces down. Cleanliness is absolutely critical, not only to avoid disease, but also dairy products, milk in particular, it absorbs odors and in the process absorbs the tastes. So you don't want milk that smells like, formula.
Onions.
So in this photograph, not only the concrete pavement, which is very obvious in the silos, but to your left, you can see the brick wall that's still there that surrounds our little pond. And you'll also see a chimney stack. That would be Robert Lee Forrest's house that appeared on that map. Clearly it burned down, and what we've got left there is a chimney stack. The house was probably used by the farm manager, but exactly when, we don't know. Another view of the farm, clearly dilapidated, but at this point, it's 1965, it had been abandoned for 20 years. So it's not surprising that it should be in this condition. You look at that silo, you could see it's made of tile. In its day, a fairly innovative use. The buildings were all of concrete block and tile. You can see some of the apparatus. He had hay drying equipment, and he was pasteurizing too somewhere on the farm. So the map starts making a little more sense when you see those photographs. You could start placing things. You could see his house next to the dairy complex. You can't see the fields in most of those photographs because they weren't taking pictures of the fields. One of the things we've been looking at a couple of the buildings he left behind, and I just took this picture today. I couldn't find those of last month. We had actually removed all the fallen trees off this structure and cleared it off so we could do a fairly detailed drawing of it. You can see there are iron pipes, bent iron pipes all around this thing. Towards the left of center, mid-ground, there's the remains of a chimney stack, a stove chimney. You could see in the immediate foreground the tile construction. Let's see, there we go. I didn't even touch it. So that's our drawing of it. It's got a concrete apron around it. This is something that Larry Jackson has drafted from our field notes. I forgot to put him on the team. Part of his tile, but there are three parts to this building. Ignore the pathway, the walkways, and the concrete apron that go around it. But the structure to the right is built of different block than the middle part. And there's also that square in the center is a series of steps. This part on the right is an addition, enclosing the original entranceway. and a new entranceway on the bottom right-hand side. That's a brick uh, steps going into the building. So at some point, Forrest added to this structure. It had a stove chimney. It's got some big standpipes. This is two big dark circles on the left. So we think water is being pumped here. We don't know exactly what's going on, how this building functioned. That big irregular figure that extends towards the bottom from the chimney, that's the chimney collapse. The whole brick chimney at some point had collapsed. We often see that on sites that had chimneys. There's also a spring house, which the picture doesn't do justice to. They were pumping a lot of water out of this spring, which is down near the creek. And water would have been critical for this operation he had over 100 cows at one point. That requires a lot of cleaning of the cows, of milking station floor, the concrete around out amongst the buildings. The dairymen had to be clean, their utensils had to be clean. It required a great deal of water, and it was pumped out of this pump house here. The superstructure is long gone. We think the water was pumped from here to what I just showed you, and then from there to other parts of the dairy, but we haven't traced out the buried water line yet. I don't remember exactly what's inscribed on here on the top. It's probably the name of the guy who poured this concrete, but it says 1926. And it looks like that water pumping station, this is part of the water pumping station. It's kind of mid-ground. Unfortunately, I don't have a mouse. Well, I could maybe you could see this, but it's right on this corner of poured concrete here. I think that's a modification of the building, suggesting it was modified in 1926, which would fit in with his increasing the herd size pretty steadily after that. He managed to hire, I think George said he's got 4, maybe 5 young men who learned farming at the National Farm School in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. This was a Jewish organization. And as far as I can tell, all the supporters, the directors, and the students were all Jewish. A lot of them presumably from Europe, training as young men, basically like a vocational school. And he hired one of their earlier graduates and 3 or 4 others besides over the years to work at his dairy farm. Now, none of them stayed there terribly long. They went on and built their careers elsewhere, but it's interesting that he should have made that connection. In fact, well, here's just from one of their annual reports, and you could see among the diplomas, the top guy there, Solomon Adler, he worked for Robert Lee Forrest. And there was another supporter named Mrs. S.J. Adler. We don't know if she was related, but she was from Baltimore and was a contributor for a number of years. But towards the bottom says what some of our graduates are doing. Well, Adler's the third one down, dairyman, Java Farms. An advertisement from 1919, up-to-date dairy farm, new buildings, including tractor. And he wants applicants to state their age, race, size, which is a little weird, family, I don't think he wanted families, wages expected with free house, city conveniences, which I take to mean flush toilets, fuel, light, bowl of milk you can drink probably, and a garden. And the second advertisement's for a capable mechanic because he's mechanizing. As early as 1920, he's got farm machinery, he's got a tractor, he's got a truck, so he needs somebody who can repair this stuff. Mind you, early motorized equipment, combustion engines that from that time were a lot easier to repair than they are today. They were much simpler. I mean, I used to be a shade tree mechanic in my youth in the 1970s. So You didn't need a special training necessarily to do that kind of work, but he was looking for somebody who could maintain that equipment. We have a couple of images of the folks who work there. Russell Gill being one of them, obviously a young white guy. I like this picture because it shows in the background that tile silo, of which he had a couple. And Robert Lester Fraser, as I recall, this is Frosty.
Yes,
Because-
that's
okay,
Frosty.
that was his nickname, Frosty, and you can again see some of the architecture behind him. Do we have a name for this fella?
Yeah, that's William Henson.
William Henson, that's right. But we don't have a date on this photograph.
1935.
1935. He is obviously a black man in 1935. So I guess one of the questions we might ask is, when did Robert Lee Forrest decide to integrate his workforce? Because clearly he was trying to keep it lily white in the early years. And then, of course,
He had white guys working the dairy operation. He had locals working the fields and
yeah.
tending.
So it might have been essentially a segregated workforce where all the field labor, local would mostly mean African Americans who were descendants from the plantations around there and still form a very discernible African American community, particularly south of our campus.
From what we can tell, he was paying about double the wage of any other farmer in the area. So anybody that wanted to work for him, as long as they could put up with his temperament, was getting good money.
Yeah, which, again, this is one of the things, well, I haven't talked about this at all really, but this is one of the things we think is motivating him, is that he was a child of the progressive era, which, he was born in 1876. The progressive era, at least in some of the local ground work, started probably the late 1880s into the 1890s and became more of a political and legal movement after the turn of the 20th century. But the progressive movement at the time was very into improving the lot of all people, of good government, corruption-free government, using technology to produce more and better food and housing for people. There's a lot of literature on that period. Teddy Roosevelt was a major figure in that movement. And so it looks like Robert Lee Forrest sort of came by that and adhered to those progressive principles through at least his entire working career, even though that movement had really largely died with World War One. World War One was such a discouraging period for most people. It's like, well, we thought we were civilized. And progressivism really kind of died with World War One.
You think that Henson could have been related to Matthew?
Well, Henson's a very common African American name. Josiah Henson, who we know where he lived up in, I guess that's Montgomery County, and a lot of archaeology has been done on that plantation where he was employed, and he eventually accompanied Peary to the North Pole. We have this really interesting report published, I think, in 1935, an investigation. And what had happened was Robert Forrest was inspecting his hay barn, and he saw steam coming up. So he saw a potential problem and called the fire department before a fire broke out. By the time they got there, spontaneous ignition had already occurred. That is because the hay was decomposing, and when it decomposes, creates heat. And eventually, the hay up on top is dry. There's a lot of dust in the barn. It becomes easy to ignite. Whereas the hay at the bottom, if it's a little bit of wet, it starts breaking down, decomposing, generating heat, and you get a spontaneous ignition. So the fire department put out the fire, extensive damage to the barn. But more interesting was that, and I think at his encouragement, the event was investigated by USDA because it was an opportunity to do a forensic study of what happens with this spontaneous ignition. So it's a very detailed report on where little pockets of fire started and under what conditions. So it's a really fabulous report, and it's got some images of the farm. In fact, these here. So the drawing at the bottom here shows the numbers are very small. The letters show you the different parts of the barn they were looking at and gives you the dimensions. But those smaller numbers show you sample areas where they found evidence of spontaneous combustion. And of course, you can see an image of the barn before and after the fire. So yeah, there's a newspaper article about stopping the blaze and everything. And this is in not, obviously the truss work, the roof would all be wooden, but the barn was essentially, concrete and tile block, and still it burned. What's interesting is that this is a dehydration system for dehydrating hay to avoid that problem. And what the machinery does is it chops up the hay into little pieces and runs it through a series of ovens to dry it out, and then sort of powers it up to a barn to a silo where it's stored and it stay nice and dry. He adopted this machinery in 1933. The fire occurred in 1934 in a more conventional barn. So he had already anticipated, the possible problems and had come up, adopted a system to avoid that problem, but he was still apparently doing conventional storage of hay, and that's where the fire broke out and caused $10,000 worth of damage. Mind you, he probably had enough money to cover that anyway, so it didn't matter a whole lot. He participated in the dairy industry, in the meetings, conventions and everything. And this one, the bottom paragraph, it talks about, this meeting up at the state hospital up in Sykesville. And he was actually one of the speakers at that conference. So this is a guy who's, he's involved, he's very much involved in the industry, and he's very involved in doing scientific daring work. He's keeping close records, although we don't have those records, just a few published instances where the amount of fat that's being produced, the butterfat content of the milk. Notice here he's referred to as Dr. Forrest. There's no evidence the man ever went to college, much less became a doctor of any sort. And it may be at about this time in 1925 that I would say not really taking on airs, but seeing himself more as a scientist. And this is another instance, sorry about the print here, but it's the best we can do. But he bought a refrigeration machine in 1933 for the milk. So he's really he's like those folks who buy the latest Apple, telephone. He's really on top of the technology, but not just to be a consumer, to actually enhance his scientific daring. Speaking of which, Forrest as assistant scientist. Sorry about the question mark. We had a photograph that Cirque has been using for years of Robert Lee Forrest when he was probably in his 30s. But at this point, we can't actually document that that picture is of him. So it will remain a question mark until we can either confirm that that is his picture or find another picture from him in his youth. To the right is a more typical image of him. At that point, he's in his 40s, balding, and a short, close cropped beard and glasses. We have this is a passport photograph of him. He did a lot of travel. I'm not going to talk about this evening. It's just too much material. But he traveled around the world a lot, including to the Soviet Union in the late 1920s. He's interested in doing science over there. He's interested, he visited the Soviet Union, Lake Chad in East Africa. He was down South America, Galapagos Islands. It looks like his interest was in part looking at wave action in these large inland seas like Lake Chad and the Caspian. I'd like to see some more details on the specifics of what he was interested in.
Jim, I just wanted to give you a heads up that we have 4 minutes left.
Okay, well, I'll go as fast as I can, but so one of the things he did was he had the geographical review. He sent them a check for $2,000 maybe, $1,000, but bought subscriptions for a bunch of Soviet scientists in the geographical review. And this is just a couple of bits about that. So, he's interested in spreading science. The science that he was doing, his traveling around, making observations, was self-funded. Philanthropist, again, when he died, the Smithsonian received not only, I mean, they got his acreage and they acquired additional acreage, plus that $1.7 million. I love this last paragraph here. More accurately, the laboratory, speaking of CERC, is almost adequate now, lacking only a few of the amenities like water and electricity. This is a journalist, a bit of an attitude. But the comparisons with James Smithson both seem to seek approval in elite circles. James Smithson was the illegitimate son of an aristocrat who was never recognized as such by his father. They both self-funded their scientific work and their travel. They both traveled extensively. Both unmarried, no children, so far as we know. Both bequeathed their wealth to the Smithsonian Institution. Smithson to actually create it. Forrest did not specify how the money was or the land was to be used. He just gave it outright to the Smithsonian. And just a couple of views of the Smithsonian when we started out in the 60s. Mostly trailers. Some of those trailers were around when I started 12 years ago. We finally got rid of them, and this is what we have today. Plus many other buildings and 2,700 acres of the largest sandbox any scientist could ask for. Okay, and that's about it. As far as next steps, we're working on some initial publications now, and we're continuing with research. I will take any questions.